So after seeing the Superman premiere and rewatching Man of Steel, I wanted to compare these two movies by reviewing them head to head in addition to highlighting their differences and looking at box office comparisons. In terms of reviewing each, I wanted to break this down in 5 categories. So to start off with the visuals or the cinematography, Man of Steel is obviously a much darker film with a pretty heavy emphasis on the science fiction element of General Zod and his army and the Krypton plot. But in terms of the on-Earth scenes, I thought you have a much more grounded feel for Man of Steel, and Superman 2025 is a lot more bright in terms of the color coding. And even though there is a pretty heavy fantasy element going on, and it is commonly described as being ripped out of a comic book, I do think you have far less of a focus on the science fiction element here. But for both, I'd say you have a CGI concern, although this is much more of the case for the third act of the Man of Steel, which just feels all over the place. And I'd have to say the action in Superman is much easier to follow and understand visually. So I would have to say that Superman wins here visually. For the plot, I would say the main two differences are the choice of time given to the origin story and the differences in antagonists. Man of Steel, of course, starts with about 15 minutes of backstory on the extinction of Krypton and how Superman gets to Earth, which is also connected to the later half of the film. But in addition to this, you have a lot of flashbacks woven into the plot, and you really see much more of Clark's upbringing on Earth. In Superman, it pretty much decides to throw you straight into the action and only give context through text. And the story is much more focused on the pure action and the introduction of other characters in the DCU. But besides this, I would say you have a lot of similarities in terms of the third act, with both Superman coming into direct conflict with an antagonist and having an outside crisis that threatens all of Earth. And there's also little time given to Clark in each of these. So I wouldn't say that either plot is really that incredible, so I would have to give this a tie. For the acting, I do think you have good acting and casting in both. However, Man of Steel just really delivers with an all-star cast. I think you have just a true powerhouse of acting in Man of Steel. I think Henry Cavill is the much better Superman. I think Michael Shannon is a lot more captivating, and Russell Crowe, Diane Lane, Kevin Costner, and Amy Adams are all really excellent. So I think the acting does have to go in Man of Steel's favor. For the dialogue, though, I thought there was some big differences in quality here. I think for Superman 2025, the dialogue is by far the weakest link of this film. And I think for Superman, a lot of the discussions felt forced and unnatural in a real-world setting. But for Man of Steel, I think the world feels a little bit more lived in, and I do think there is a bit more chemistry there. So I'd say in terms of the dialogue, similar to acting, Man of Steel is just a tough act to fall after, so I would have to give Man of Steel the edge here as well. But for the world building, I think this is really where Superman shines. I think it's definitely the best aspect of the new movie, and I think this is really where Man of Steel struggles. I think the Justice Gang in Superman is a great tease to the future world building of the Justice League, and I think this is pretty exciting for the DCU. And without looking entirely in hindsight at the DCEU, I did think that Man of Steel didn't really do anything to establish a larger world or continuity going forward. And I almost think it serves better as a standalone film rather than a start to a franchise. So in summary, I would have to say that Man of Steel is the better film. I would give it an 8 out of 10 versus a 7 out of 10 for Superman 2025. But I do think the strong suits for Superman do provide a little bit more of an optimistic feeling for the rest of the DCU. However, I do think the DCU is going to have a clear direction direction in terms of these future projects. And to look at the box office comparisons, it is looking like Man of Steel is going to take the win here, even adjusting for a lot of crucial differences. You have Man of Steel coming in at $670 million, and it is looking like Superman isn't even going to pass this number without taking into account inflation or the larger international market. And I would also say on top of this, you have a higher ticket price today, even above what the adjustments for inflation would be of previous ticket prices. And if we were just to account for inflation alone, you'd have Man of Steel coming in the 900 million range for today's box office. So there's really no comparison there in terms of which film is better for numbers alone. But feel free to let me know your thoughts on this, and I'll see you later.